and I'm really, really pleased to introduce to you tonight to speak is Amy Peace. We go back a long way, Amy and I, which is unfortunate for her. I keep recurring in her life. We used to work in the same office. Amy is an incredible engineer and is the one who fixed all of my spreadsheets, and I miss her terribly because I'm rubbish without them. But she's now, few twists of fate, now works in the same organisation as me, finally, after all these years of trying. We were going to set up a consultancy together called Bits and Pieces, but that's maybe for the future. But I think of anyone better to tell you about how your life is going to be completely affected in the future by the circular economy and how that's going to sort out the problems we have around sustainability. So Amy, please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mike. I was going to do a poll at the start to say, what's your favourite shape? Mike said he liked interactivity, but basically you're wrong unless you say circles. But apparently you want a bit more technical questions as we go along. So yes, the title we've gone for today is, the future of what we buy, trying to focus in on, although I typically work kind of more on sort of industrial side, really thinking about kind of what the implications of the circular economy, which as you can see is the topic which I focus most of my working life on, onto your lives and what the implications are. So I have a robot on the front because in the future, the robots is always about the future, obviously. Right, let's try and progress the things. So me as a background, I'm trained as a chemical engineer, although some people call it process engineering. I probably prefer process engineering because I like kind of just the whole thing goes to another thing and less of the chemistry. Mike's the sort of person I'd ask, what does this chicken wire mean, if I want to know about chemistry. But yeah, my background, I first came to the Northwest when there was a really big company called ICI still in existence. I was the last of the sponsored students, so I came here just after school before university. Then went to Imperial, did chemical engineering, and then came back to the Northwest. It hadn't put me off, and spent several years working for INEOS, who you probably know have a big manufacturing site in Runcorn, but also overseas, did a bit in America as well. I then kind of moved out of directly from industry into an organisation called Chemicals Northwest, and that's where I had the joy of sharing an office with Mike because his organisation also were based there. And at Chemicals Northwest, I looked after programs for sustainable development and innovation. So how to make the chemicals industry as a whole in the Northwest more sustainable. Then moved to a very small company called Brightest, who basically are, how do you understand what is going on in your process? How do you get your chemists talking to your engineers, talking to your business people, and really understanding how to improve a process, or just what on earth is going on here? Why has this thing broken? With that, I've mainly been working in Europe. So SciBar I've put there is one of these, you may have kind of heard, EU programs of under Horizon 2020 to help industry and academia collaborate. And there's a bit of it called SciBar, Sustainable Process Industry through Resource and Energy Efficiency. So I did some big projects there about how do we make sure that projects that the public sector are funding are actually more sustainable, and how do we make sure stuff actually ends up in industry and not in just nice glossy reports. And then it's only in May that I moved to Innovate, but in theory sharing an office with Mike, but it's all virtual now. So I've joined the manufacturing and materials team, and I'm the lead on circular economy, which is what I'm mainly going to be talking about today. So for those who don't know what chemical and process engineering is, this is basically how I describe it to most people I meet. It is heat and mass balances. How do you turn stuff with energy into different stuff? And how do you manage or avoid the annoying stuff that comes along with it? And that is the essence. If anyone tries to make out it's more complicated than that, it's not. It's just understanding what those different blobs are. What I've always been particularly interested in is how do these processes, systems work in the real world? So how do people actually influence people's decisions, whether I'm going to do something to my process? How do they choose whether they're going to invest in new technology? Or you know, just what their priorities are every day on kind of how they're going to run sort of chemical plants and what products are they going to make. Again, I have a big aversion to people producing big glossy reports that don't go anywhere other than as doorsteps. It's all about what actually makes a difference in the real world. So what does industry do? What does the process industry do? We make stuff. So most of my working life has been in this process industries end of thing, and most of that in the chemical sector. So it really is kind of the, what do you get from raw materials and where do you process it into these sometimes commodity, sometimes kind of more niche materials, but it is kind of your chemicals, metals, minerals, glass, cement. Downstream from that, obviously you've got more the sort of downstream manufacturers which actually turn those materials and parts into stuff. And my current role moves me also into this area as well. So I am learning lots more about robots. As I move into this area, we had fewer robots in the chemicals industry, but now I see them being much more important. And then obviously downstream from that is the stuff that actually ends up at you, including robots. Now, obviously this stuff, I'm keen to sort of not just say it's a car, it's a house, but actually what do they do? What does society actually need? And that's things like your clothes, your transport, food, shelter, and less about kind of the actual things they are, because that's when industry should be doing its job, actually providing the stuff that society needs and not worrying too much about, hey, but don't we make widgets? Don't we make cars? You know, you are much more the providers of things that society needs. And most of the time, particularly in sort of history, things go in a big long line. We dig things up, we turn them into parts, we combine them together, we transport them around, and we make robots, which we then let consumers buy, give to their children, they break, and they put them in the bin. So that is what most of our products end up sort of going through. Now, obviously, the things that hit the headlines then are the visible thing that's wrong with that. When things end up in the ocean on Blue Planet 2, people start taking notice of where supply chains mean that resources are not ending up doing useful stuff, but actually end up causing either unsightly or very damaging effects on our environment or on people. And if you kind of want to know about kind of the scale of kind of where all the stuff goes, I love a Sankey diagram. I'm very much a fan of diagrams, and this is a big Sankey diagram, which basically shows all the resources kind of in the globe, where they start off their life as kind of minerals, oils, fossil fuels, biomass, that's all your plants and living, growing things. And then where do they actually end up going? So they go down the diagram, they get processed, say by the process industry, and you can see they kind of span out into lots of different products. And then you get down to the bottom, and those are those societal needs kind of, you know. A big chunk of it goes into housing, where obviously Mike spends a lot of his days doing sort of construction side of things. A big chunk of our resources goes into that. And these are kind of the other things that they go into sort of making. See, food's probably like the second biggest of those things. But food, unlike the other one, is quite good at sending sort of unused resources back round the loop again, because, you know, you obviously get things like composting. They're quite obvious ways of sending things back round again from sort of biomass materials. The harder stuff is all the kind of the metals and the other materials, is trying to get them back round the loop. I think the disturbing thing here is just how much stuff actually ends up in the environment as unrecoverable. You know, we started at the top here, sort of 102, and 67.4 ending up dispersed into the environment. So there are problems with this system. And that's just the visible bit. Obviously, with all these steps, we are using energy to process the materials. And with that energy, we are producing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse warming gases. So one thing we like to sort of refer to it as kind of the embedded energy, the embedded carbon that we are putting into these products as we go through this cycle, or this line, as we call it. And why should we care about that? Well, you're all busy washing your hands, staying isolated and doing very well, and watching out for this big COVID wave that hopefully won't hit us again. But behind that, I mean, some people say there's still bigger economic shocks to come, but climate change is a huge problem on the horizon. I mean, I don't know kind of how much everybody looks at news reports, but you know, we lost Canada's last sort of ice shelf, I think, broke up this week. The fires in Siberia have been sort of bigger than sort of most nations' sort of global output of emissions just in kind of the last few weeks. That these things is not long term. These things are hitting us now and are only going to get worse. So we have to try and do something about these carbon emissions, and fairly promptly. So we are doing some things in the UK, and the UK has been very good at patting itself on the back about this. We have a committee for climate change, and we were one of the first countries in the world to actually sign up to going to net zero. So by 2050, we want to try and get to net zero carbon dioxide emissions. Sounds great. You know, we've got a plan. And some people would say, haven't we done well so far? You know, if we look at kind of where our emissions are at the moment, we're pretty much back to the late 1800s as to kind of our total CO2 emissions of where we actually got there. So it's kind of like, yeah, we've done really well. We've managed to decouple kind of economic growth from these emissions. But, you know, a lot of that has been done by just looking at the energy, and where we used to get a lot of our energy from, coal, we've done a pretty good job of getting rid of that. So, I mean, the article there, I think it was an Observer one, just from this Sunday, it is really kind of very much in the news how much we have managed to get rid of coal. I mean, the graph bottom left, even just as early, you know, as recent as 2012, we were about 40% of our energy generation coming from coal. Now we're less than 10%. I mean, this chart on the right, I would thoroughly recommend, if you like having a day-by-day breakdown of where we all get all our energy from, there's this great little graphic there at I Am Kate, where you can sort of minute by minute see where the energy is coming from in the UK. This was done at night. There is no solar on this one, but just how big the wind contribution is towards the UK energy is a really big good news story there. We have done a lot to decarbonize our energy supply. But is that enough? So the reason why we're kind of trying to reduce our CO2 emissions is that I think there's general agreement, scientific consensus, is that the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is directly linked to the amount of global warming we can expect. And the amount that is in the atmosphere has been steadily going up. The little zigzag is because it is seasonal. But the trend, it's not a good one. In fact, some would say it's gone beyond linear even. We might be even accelerating as it's going up there. And CO2 stays in the atmosphere for a long time. So we can't just say, what are we emitting this year? Haven't we done well? We can't just leave things till 2050 and, well, 2049 and then suddenly go, now we've got to zero. Again, pat ourselves on the back. We have a limited amount of carbon dioxide that we think we can put into the atmosphere to stop us getting to some of these tipping point temperatures. 2 degrees was in some of the original agreements on what we should try and limit ourselves to. Things like the Stern report were very good at sort of saying what the economic argument was for limiting to 2 degrees. Then the Paris Agreement got countries to sign up to, no, we should really try for 1.5 degrees. But that is a much smaller bucket of carbon that we have got left to emit if we want to try and restrict to 1.5. So efforts have been done to say, carve up, okay, we've got this much carbon dioxide we can left to emit over the next few years. How much of that can go into sort of making the stuff that we need and use? But first of all, here's a bit of a question, just to get a view on how much of the kind of the carbon dioxide, this energy, these emissions comes from the energy we use, like in our cars, heating our homes, electricity, versus producing the products we use every day. So actually making the cars, making the clothes and the food. So Mike, do you want to do this as a poll, or do you want people just to lob their ideas into the chat, since we've just got a few there?
Did you put the poll in beforehand?
I did, and it's not showing, so obviously did not say.
Probably
so
because
just the chat.
I needed to have it, but so I think it'd be really good if everyone put in the chat what they thought.
Yeah, so we're looking what % of our total emissions do we think comes from making stuff rather than from, you know, say the fuel in your cars, heating your homes, electricity? I cannot see the chat, so I will. Oh.
You should be able to see the chat.
Yeah, I was going to say I stopped screen sharing so I could see this chat. Put your guesses there. Vote now.
What percentages do we think?
Tell us a number. Is everyone kind of like waiting just to see? Yeah, good guess. We have a guess. You get points for being the first guesser as well. Thank you.
Which way, Sean?
This is how much we currently use in making things, making the product. So there's clothes, cars, robots, wine.
More robots.
Yeah, we gotta. Yeah, making food. Yeah, that too.
Fertilizers.
Okay, we've got a few guesses. So everything from sort of 40 up to 80. Yeah, pretty good. I mean, I'm not sure if I'd say they kind of the results are pretty alarming. Let me bring up my screen again. Get to the right page. Any more guesses, Mike, while I'm just bringing it back up again?
Oh, you've got a lot, around the 60-70% here.
Okay. Let me go back to screen share. Okay, so there was an analysis done of it just sort of last year, sort of globally wise. And you're not a million miles off, I have to say, you lot. The estimate is that 55% is energy, and 45% of all our emissions come from making stuff. Now, I'm interested kind of that a lot of you went quite high on that number. I think kind of when we tend to sort of ask people sort of in industry, you know, what should they focus on when trying to look for net zero and way to stop climate change? Most people focus on, oh, we've got to decarbonize our energy. We've got to use more renewables. They really do just focus on the energy side. So to hear that it's as high as 45% is actually surprising to people, but obviously not to you lot who think it perhaps even should be higher. But there's a bit of more breakdown kind of that, in case you're intrigued. Sort of about, you know, half of that 45% is on that kind of that food side, the agriculture, forestry, or the land use thing, and the rest sort of on the industry and material production. So, I mean, it still brings home the decarbonisation of energy and using less energy is probably the most important thing. But this is such a significant portion of the pie, we should not forget about it. And using our materials more effectively is really key here. So if we have a look at kind of how much carbon we could emit in this space to limit us to 1.5, the estimates, I mean, this is by 2100 rather than 2050, is that we've got about 500, I think these are sort of gigatons of carbon we could emit. Now, the projections of where we would be, even if we just did energy efficiency on our sort of how we produce things, was that we're still going to overshoot this massively, sort of this 918. Even if we kind of have all the renewable energies in there, zero carbon energy, as well as making everything more energy efficient, we're still going to go beyond the bucket which we've allocated towards making stuff. So we have to do something else. And that's where kind of circular economy comes into this. So we've already covered kind of a bit of the supply chain, how we dig things up, make parts, products, use the thing and waste it for our little robot. Circular economy is about how do you loop back to make better use of all these valuable materials. So the first one on this is the repair one, which, you know, something we used to do a lot more of. But often this is kind of how our stuff are actually designed that enable us to repair things. Now imagine we kind of put in a certain amount of carbon into making a robot, but if that robot does not allow you to change the battery, you're immediately limiting the lifespan of that robot. Now, if you can just use the robot for twice as long by being able to change the battery just once, you've automatically kind of halved the carbon footprint of using the robot for that amount of time, because you've split it over twice the amount of time that you could actually use it for. So you can imagine doing things that allow you to repair things automatically are kind of saving carbon because you are not having to buy new materials. Then there's the reuse, and this is reused by other people. So at its most basic, you know, I mean, for things like toy robots and things, we do have sort of second-hand markets for a lot of products, which help get products used by other things. But that's on a very much an ownership basis, saying somebody owns it and then you pass it on to somebody else to own. There's much more interesting stuff here on maybe I don't need to own this thing at all. I mean, Mike was suggested, has anybody sort of knowingly had a kind of bought into a service, you know, loaned a product rather than bought it? Kind of any hands come, any suggestions of what that thing might be? Anything in the chat, Mike? No, you're on mute anyway. So, but this is one of the questions that a lot of people don't perhaps think.
No, there's nothing in the chat. There's nothing in the chat.
I will just sort of say. I mean, and in the olden days, kind of, you used to have like radio rentals, so people used to like rent TVs and things. Those things kind of are less obvious.
You mean my childhood, Amy?
Oh yeah, much more relevant. But there's much more interesting models where people don't realise they're necessarily renting things. So things like Netflix, you're not owning the films, you're not owning the DVDs, you are just using that product for a set amount of time. And that can also be brought in for some more sort of tangible products. So people like B&Q have looked at models where do you need to own a power tool? You know, do you end up just buying a really cheap one that breaks because you're not going to use it for very long? Wouldn't it be better to say, I only need this expensive power tool for one particular job? I'd rather have the best power tool out there and I will just lease it for that amount of time. So people are doing a lot more business models now of kind of where saying, do people really need to own all this stuff? Can we do better ways of helping you share them? And things like in transport as well, things like Zipcar and models like that have really taken off. You know, they're not seen as being an inferior way of owning a product, but actually give you a lot of benefits. You don't have to, worry about parking and sort of maintenance of that vehicle and things. So that is a really kind of interesting one of where else can that sort of model be implemented. The next leap is remanufacture, which some people call refurbish, but this is sort of different to repair, whereas repair is kind of you're keeping that thing and you're just making sure you can keep it in use. Remanufacture is where manufacturers or other manufacturers take a product that has worn out in some way, but instead of kind of taking it all apart and sort of full recycling, they will just take out the element that has broken or worn away and remanufacture that part. So it might be replacing just the worn out bit, and then they've got a product which is as good as new and can sell that on. And the likes of JCB do this a lot with some of their diggers, because you put a lot of effort into making these parts. If you can actually get those things back, refurbish them, that is a much better model, and you're more likely then to actually design the parts to be longer lasting or easy to take out in order to do that. And then the final loop, recycle, that's kind of the one that most people sort of think of when we think about circulating sort of resources back round. But that really is kind of almost a last resort really here. Most of our recycling involves shredding things to bits and getting things back to the base materials, often sort of downgrading the value of those materials and putting in often a lot more effort to get those materials back into a product and use. So yes, that is an important part of the loop, but actually it shouldn't be kind of the first thing we think of when trying to get more value out of stuff, perhaps one of the later things. I've also put in an extra one here because you've got to put in as many re's as possible these days. But regeneration is another one where if you take the time scale longer here and say, we've been doing these linear supply chains for years and years, decades, we've done a lot of bad to the world. And although people kind of say they want to be sustainable, most of the time that is just, we want to be less bad. We want to we're still going to make this thing, but we'll try and save some energy, make this less bad. If we want to really sort out kind of some of the environmental problems, we need to do regeneration. We need to actually undo some of the bad of past supply chains. And there's a lot of businesses that are doing this, not to, sort of with eco-credentials, they're not being paid to clear up a service. They're actually managing to make products and services out of the things whilst cleaning up the environment, for example. So is this enough to help us get there? Well, it can certainly do a lot, kind of the order of magnitudes we're kind of looking for. So this was from this Ellen MacArthur Foundation analysis of how much could be done by looking more circular ways of using our products. So doing things like eliminating waste, reusing products, or recirculating materials. And they just looked at sort of 4 of the biggest sectors: steel, aluminium, plastics, and cement, and said that, you know, versus where we would be at 2050, so that's kind of the second column there, if we did all these various things, we could save 40% of the carbon emissions there. So this is significant things we should be trying to do much more across sectors. But those are all quite sort of abstract things. I wanted to give some sort of real life ones. There's the option at this point whether people want a 5-minute break, and then we'll go into the some more examples, or whether you want me to push on. You can demonstrate your desires using the art of mime or the comment box.
Does anyone need a quick break?
That looks like it. That looks someone wants their tea topped up. So.
Right, we'll give you 5 minutes. 5
minutes. 5 minutes for tea top up.
Fresh beer, fresh cold towel on your head, and I'll remember this time to pause the recording.
Okay. Okay, so we'll crack on with some examples here. And first of all, I want to start some examples of, these were all the circles my son drew on his last day of nursery. He's 9 now, but I still remember this picture. I think there were 17 circles and one which looks more like a bomb. But, you know, they obviously foresaw my career path. So I just want to give you some examples here and also give you a break from me talking. We're going to cross our fingers that my internet connection stays stable enough for you to see our first one, which is Elvis and Cressy. So here we go.
Elvis and Cressy is an upmarket designer label based in Kent that produces handbags and belts which sell for hundreds of pounds. Actress Cameron Diaz is a fan. But what makes their products unique are their raw materials, primarily old fire hoses.
In fact, since they started making them a decade ago, none of London's fire hose has gone into landfill. That means more than 170 tonnes of material has been reclaimed. And the company also recycles all sorts of other unusual bits and pieces, including auction banners, tea sacks and parachute silk.
Our environment correspondent Yvette Austin reports for the latest in our War on Rubbish series.
They've seen active service for a quarter of a century, fighting fires and saving lives. Historically, decommissioned hoses would have gone to the scrap heap, but these are destined for better care.
In 2005, we discovered that London's damaged, decommissioned hoses were going to landfill. And we established Elvis and Cressy to save the hoses. And the reason they go to landfill is because fire hose is a double wall nitrile rubber jacket surrounding this woven nylon core. And that means you can't shred it, melt it, and make new hoses. It's a composite. So it was going to landfill.
After washing, they're lovingly sliced and sewed. Vintage products, brand new. And they work with leather offcuts too, discarded by premium brands.
This was once waste leather, and we are actually turning it into a large leather rug, and we are turning it into something beautiful, and in doing that we're challenging people's perceptions of what waste actually is.
It's a business that's gradually grown from producing a single belt to a whole range, from bags and purses to key rings and rugs. And recycling is at the heart of everything they do.
Well, there's a lot of things that are special about this. One, it's made of 25-year-old vintage fire hose. Two is that we've been able to use all of the fire hose. You'll notice it's made of these sections, which are all based on the 10-centimeter diameter of the hose, which means our designs are a zero-waste design so that we're not having any scraps produced when we're cutting this out. Also, the lining for this is an auction banner. The packaging that it comes in is also reclaimed. So there really isn't anywhere that we won't go and to any length we won't go to rescue or reclaim other materials.
They're designer goods, yes, up to £330, but half of all profits made from the hose range goes to the firefighters' charity, more than £30,000 last year, and all out of something that would once have gone to landfill. Yvette Austin, BBC South East Today, Sittingbourne.
Yeah, Mike said he'd get me one of these bags as a thanks for doing this. I don't know, do you remember that? So yeah, I think what's interesting about this one, that it's a great example of the company not just sort of doing something great out of the resources, that actually giving something back, actually valuing that waste back to the fire service, not just sort of saying thanks, you don't need this waste anymore, we'll just go and get all the value out of it. But at the same time, it's sustainable luxury, and we find kind of particularly in the clothing industry and things, there are some really great niche brands that are kind of selling kind of sustainable things with a premium, sort of with a luxury price tag. So we have some really successful business models, but it's not hitting that mass market generally. And that's where we kind of really need to sort of make the difference if we're going to sort of tackle climate change. We've got another example here, and Mike has informed me that he has got a Kyocera printer in his office because of this case study. So I'm glad that this has sort of made a difference here. But this is an example of a printer manufacturer who really kind of looked at, where all the carbon was in their production and how they could actually sort of manage getting better management of the product right through to its end, what happens at end of life, how to get the materials back. So they actually looked at completely redesigning the product and downsized the number of parts from 70 to 5. They really cut down on the complexity of the printer, and enabled it so it could actually be disassembled more easily, and also offered a service model so that, again, people could actually be charged on how much they print rather than just having a printer there. The whole sort of case study goes into a lot more depth about some of the sort of material innovations, about the kind of the printed drum and things they did there in order to enable them to kind of downsize the number of parts here. But the numbers are really quite startling. The carbon footprint consumables down 55%, waste down by up to 85%. These are big hitting changes to sort of supply chain of something which is a much more mass market, that people have in their studies. Thanks for that, Mike. I've got one more example. This is 3 minutes if you can tolerate another video, but I think this one's again another good one of a company that's tried to go for something that's a product that's in much more sort of common usage. Well, it was when we were allowed to go to offices, but has done much more to kind of really shape their business on, we're going to try and do this thing because it makes business sense, but also we're going to do what we can to help on some other sustainability issues as we go along.
We believe that every workplace can and should be attractive, sustainable and lower cost.
Office furniture these days is really expensive. There's also a hell of a lot of furniture going to waste. What we realised is the power of the circular economy means that we can actually take some of that waste furniture, remanufacture that to as new condition, and we can do that at a price that's half or lower the cost of a new piece of furniture. I think people really get that you can save money and be sustainable.
We've done over 50 projects with clients including RBS, Crown Estate, Pilkington and Imperial College London.
Public Health Wales, we had a great project with them for Cardiff.
We were really impressed with what we'd seen here at Capital Quarter 2.
Now they're moving staff to a new space in Swansea, and they've asked us to help them to design that and then fit that out with sustainable furniture. The first stage when we work with a client is to actually agree a design. Second stage then is the remanufacturing. Remanufacturing is about using an engineering technical process to bring it back to as new. Finally, there's the installation. So we like to do that ourselves, using as much disabled and long-term unemployed labour as we possibly can.
I had a lot of problems with drugs, alcohol. Then the day before my daughter's first birthday, I found out she was my daughter. I decided to give up all the drugs. Yeah, because I didn't wean myself off the drugs. It played with my head quite a bit. I was suffering with anxiety and depression. Right office helped change my life. Keep me on the straight and narrow, so to speak. It can be technical work on times, which I love, and it's physical work. It makes you feel good as a father knowing that you've got the money to provide for your kids as well, as well as you enjoying the work you do.
When we need new furniture, and that happens every so often in order to fill an order, we look to the best and most sustainable socially and environmentally organisations to provide that.
The people we employ here are a mixture of predominantly disabled people. People need to have the right to work, disabled or not disabled.
It's just fantastic. It's wonderful. I keep saying fantastic because I'm just overwhelmed by it. Seeing our people who've been in disparate offices around the Swansea area and West Wales area in one place, having lunch together, that's added value for public health for our population.
So for us, success is all about an office that people love and they find really easy to achieve what they need to achieve through their days.
When you go through this journey, you never think the same way again.
So who else thought that was a bit weird, seeing people in an office together, close, without any boundaries up? I mean, it's scary kind of how much has changed in the last few months. As you can imagine, they're doing quite a lot of business at the moment on actually how to redesign offices to actually facilitate people coming back to work. So yeah, I think the great thing about that is, whereas kind of with Elvis and Cressy producing a great product, but clearly kind of premium price, Ripe Office are producing furniture that is the same quality as, you know, the top class office furniture you can buy, but at a cheaper price. You know, they're showing that by using this material without having to kind of break it all up, shred it, and, you know, do full on recycling, just by remanufacturing the bits that need repairing, you can create something that is actually a better price for most consumers. So you can have a better quality product that you might not have previously been able to afford. That's the end of it. So yeah, some of the issues and challenges just to cover that we've come across the way there. So yeah, getting beyond the niche to mass market is not always a trivial thing, and particularly in the clothing industry, things like sort of Primark and things, the scale of materials going through the mass market still needs some big innovations to try and get that more circular. I put carbon versus circularity because every time you are trying to take something back around the loop, you are often using energy. And a lot of people are like, wouldn't it be great if we were fully circular, if every material sort of was recovered and reused? But you know, that very last bit of material that you try and recover is going to use more and more energy to try and get back into use. So there's always got to be a bit of a trade-off there between how important is it to recover that material, or is it benign? You know, do we mind kind of not recovering that material versus the energy and associated carbon it is to actually get it back into use? There's also an issue with, I say issue, but a challenge with optimizing the whole, not individual products. This is where a lot of our products have been really kind of streamlined to be as efficient and, you know, as good in use as possible. I mean, phones are kind of can do so much and are small because they've really done a lot of effort to put all the components as close together as possible to make the phone run really efficiently. But that makes it very difficult to get those parts apart. But if we want to make the whole system better and say at the end of life we want to be able to get these materials back out again, you might say, well, we might need to have slightly bigger phones, you know. We might need to limit the amount of materials that are used to make our products so that at the end of life, we can get those materials back again to make into new things. And on a similar vein to that is, you know, we're encouraged to be resource efficient and cut down on the amounts of materials that are in products. But if you get down to kind of minuscule ppm, parts per million of an element, say in a phone, that becomes then very difficult to recover at the end because it's in such low quantities that spread across, you know, millions of products is much more difficult to recover than if there was a big blob of that material that's very easy to kind of remove. And then finally, you know, you see with things like sort of washing machines, you know, going A+, A++, A++++. I don't know how many pluses there are on a washing machine these days. There is an argument that if you're trying to keep products in use for longer and longer, you're missing the opportunity to bring in new efficient models because you're keeping the old ones going. An argument against that, or a way around that mitigator, is that you build products to be more modular, so you can take out the inefficient bits and upgrade them as they go along, rather than just saying we've got to change them for new. So near the end now, but I just want to kind of emphasize kind of how quickly do we need to act here. And yeah, for those who were wondering about my lovely background, which is just hiding the mess behind me, these are often referred to as the climate stripes. This is global temperatures, and as you can imagine, red is where things have gone above average, and blue is below average since 1850. And particularly today, I am very much in the red zone. You know, things are changing very rapidly on climate change. We need to be aware that this is a very pressing issue. And there is a temptation to think that, you know, should we just steadily reduce emissions as we get towards this sort of 2050 goal? Now, if we'd started doing that back in 2000, as this graph shows, we could have gone on quite a nice steady downward curve on like basically reversing the emissions increases we'd done previously. But every year that you don't start reducing emissions, you're using up that bucket. And so you've got less and less in that bucket that you've got to spread across the remaining sort of years towards your target. So because we're already kind of much later on than when that steady curve was, it's not a straight line to 2050. We have to start doing some of these massive changes very, very urgently. But we've got this covered. We've got the CCC reports, don't we? Well, no, this Committee for Climate Change and the Progress Report to Parliament, it's worth knowing that that is about territorial emissions, emissions that we produce in the UK. This does not include this embedded carbon in the products that we import. And you could say a logical end to this is that we don't do any more manufacturing in the UK. We just import all our products and let all that carbon emissions go elsewhere, because then we'll look good as the UK because we'll have reduced our territorial emissions. But as you can imagine, that's not the aim. You know, global emissions is what really counts here. So my day job's doing quite a lot of raising the importance of this, but also trying to quantify how big this issue is and sort of what opportunities we have to try and do policies and programs to acknowledge how much carbon is in the products that we buy, the materials that we buy in, and how can we get kind of more of sort of efficient overall system rather than just drawing arbitrary boundaries around a country. So this is kind of the recap of kind of where we think for the future of what we buy, why things might be different. So do expect to see a lot more kind of services, not products, not necessarily owning things. I hope people become more conscious of embedded carbon. There have been efforts in the past to do carbon labeling on things, which sort of got phased out. But I think a lot more people, what with climate strikes and similar, are much more conscious about carbon. And I think we would see a return to products being labelled as to how much carbon is involved in them. The right to repair, there's a European directive on that, and we might see kind of what happens in the UK. But manufacturers are being almost forced to enable people to repair their items, which is a good thing. Remanufacturing is not a word everybody uses, but actually seeing that as not being a worse thing, you kind of see, do you want a refurbished phone or do you want a brand new one? But actually seeing the benefit of having a refurbished, remanufactured object as being better than something that's required sort of virgin raw materials. And just this last bit, yeah, doing less bad is not good enough here. You know, we really need to do some projects which are doing this regeneration aspect and undoing the bad of the past. So we should basically, it's so urgent, we should act now and do everything, improve all our supply chains. I would also encourage an element of doing nothing as well. And this is where kind of my favorite quote to end on this, you know, there is nothing so useless as doing efficiently that which should not be done at all. We really do need to ask ourselves, you know, when we look at the societal need, what products do we actually need? What things should we be using that remaining carbon budget on? And what things should we just stop doing and stop buying? And maybe toy robots are not one of those things, because robots are ace. So that is where I'd like to end. Ta-da.
Well, thank you, Amy, and I'm loving all the robots. Getting some virtual claps here. Please do keep putting your questions into the chat box for me to pitch over to Amy, and we'll just kind of go through a few things now. Obviously, I get to ask the first questions as chair, but right at the start, you talked about the all the stuff that's wandering off into the environment on that lovely big Sankey diagram. I mean, I'm assuming some of that is just you know, built assets, which are very hard to get stuff back from, but I'm guessing quite a lot of it is mining spoil. I don't think we understand just quite how inefficient it is extracting things out of the earth.
Yeah, I mean, kind of, we love sort of aluminium as a product. You know, we try and lightweight cars by making them aluminium and things. But the amount of environmental waste that's left over from kind of trying to get sort of aluminium kind of out the ground. These are things which happen overseas. We don't see these things here, and they don't often make the news. But yeah, that fundamental getting stuff out of the ground is incredibly energy intensive and resource intensive, I should say. And actually, yeah, last week I was just in Wales, and I was just reminded kind of the slate quarries that were around us. You know, they're still quarrying slate there, but only 98%. Only 98%. 98% isn't the product. 98% is the waste. 2% of what they dig out is actually the stuff that ends up as a product.
I'm very happy to say we funded a company that turned that waste into into a slate tile that is affordable, looks just like real slate, and is easier and faster to fit for tiling roofs, so you don't have to use a proper professional tiler. Particularly when slate tilers are a very declining skill set. So sometimes there's a very clever ways you can get out of this. And that's the other thing about the Elvis and Cress example. I mean, I love it. If I could afford it, I would definitely buy you one. After I bought myself one, because there's some lovely man bags there as well. But they, because of what they're made from, they really do last forever. And that's the other thing. They've not just made a good product there. They've made something that just survives all kind of batterings. I know people who have them, and they've had them a long time. And you wouldn't know. So maybe this is a question for everyone, particularly as I know there's a few people on here who are pretty good at this kind of thing. But Sue's asking, what have you stopped buying in the do nothing area?
Yeah, maybe I should ask everyone that. I mean, it's interesting. Like, there's certainly a lot of things we thought we would do to our house when we moved in. Like, we've lived in this house for 10 years, and we came in and we went, oh, well, we'll obviously change those carpets. We'll obviously change those kitchen cabinets. You know, and we've still got the same kitchen cabinets that were kind of there from like 10 years ago. And, you know, it is, sustainability is very much kind of up there. It's not just laziness. You know. We do question ourselves, you know, do we really need to change those? You know, do we really need to change that carpet? To be honest, it's fine. I mean, we tell ourselves maybe once our child stops throwing food around, that maybe that's a good time to change carpets. But yeah, it's very conscious kind of the rate at which people do kind of refurbish and change things in their homes. We've kind of very consciously tried to not do that. But that's maybe just, why the house is a mess. Yeah,
certainly they're not owning things. I mean, I still, to my shame, still buy some CDs when there's a generation growing up that just got no idea there's a physical form for music. And
I just don't trust the online music people that I will always have my favourite tracks available. So yeah, we still have
middle age now.
Yeah. Don't trust them. Don't trust this technology. Yeah.
But as Claire pointed out earlier, and Claire's really good at doing this, is you know, there's a lot, and you kind of mentioned it as well. There's a good borrowing culture often within neighbourhood communities to say, you know, why should we all own a drill or all own a wheelbarrow when we can all use each other's. You know, so that's why my neighbour came round while we're in the break. You know, we've been swapping and loaning stuff. Don't buy this, I'll do that. You know, and I did actually go and drill some holes for him last week that he needed because his drill wasn't up to it. So it's certainly I think, where can I borrow this from someone now rather than own if I can? But we all need to get better at that. We've grown up with a culture of owning things rather than loaning or borrowing them. And even better than borrowing a drill is you just want to buy a hole, don't you? It's the hole you want, not the drill. Speaking of that, so the next question is about the kind of business model issue. That a lot of this is the incentives are all set up wrong in the first place for manufacturers to really take ownership. And the classic one I hear of quite a lot is, of course, the health sector only makes money when you're ill. It doesn't make money when you're healthy.
Yep.
Because we're not prepared to pay to be healthy, but we're prepared to stop being ill. And so some of it's our own buying behaviour, and the incentive setup's all wrong. What do we do about that, Amy? There's a big question for you.
I mean, maybe we should promote some of the things that we're doing, innovate in funding feasibility studies. But yeah, sometimes it is just getting people to talk to people outside of their box, their immediate sort of suppliers and customers, and actually, you know, talking to people who actually design systems, design the way you kind of interface with your customers, and really kind of working with them to sort of challenge, you know, how could we do this differently, rather than just saying, oh, well, we normally sell to X, who then sells to the customer and things. So I think it's worth kind of taking opportunities to really work through your assumptions and challenge your assumptions, because things are changing rapidly. I mean, you know, as I say about kind of the Netflix things, and you know, Blockbuster, you know, had the opportunity to buy Netflix, didn't they? And things. You know, a lot of people kind of say it's always going to be the way it is, and then miss the opportunity and actually can completely lose their own business because they haven't seen the change. So yeah, I would kind of say that even things that sound impossible now, you should still always be testing the assumptions that you've made in deciding that this is a difficult or impossible thing.
You've got the mobile phone companies expecting to not sell data in the future. You've got the energy companies expecting to sell comfort, not electrons or therms in the future, because that's just not the way the market will go. It's very much, as you said at the start, buying what it is you're actually needing, rather than I think just turning it into some kind of product and it becoming your problem. That's what a lot of this is, saying, you've bought it now, consumer, it's your problem to deal with it. I'm kind of interested if anyone's done any kind of loan services. We talked about, you did ask the question earlier, but anyone ever loaned any clothing? Not second-hand clothing, but you can rent clothing. And I wouldn't include a tux here for fellas. I go to enough things where I have to wear a tux that I do own a tux. I have to say.
I used to. Now you need to just own,
No, I'm
not much of a tux.
Just have to wear a green screen.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think I've ever sort of done any clothing loaning, but certainly in Cardiff, there was a really strong network of people lending things. I mean, I remember borrowing cool boxes and freezer cubes before going away for a camping weekend, right up to, electric drills and fairly decent bits of tools and bits of kit. But I must say that the attitude particularly in South Wales, seemed to be a lot better. There were a lot of companies like Orange Box, who I think were quite like Ride, the office furniture, who just have this. I don't know whether it's Wales have passed the Future Generations Bill and the Environment Bill years ahead of the UK government. So I don't know if it's just sort of part of the Welsh attitude and that sort of wanting to be the leader in the sector, but certainly. I've really noticed a difference moving from South Wales up to Chester, that there isn't quite the same, not quite the same impetus that there has been.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we kind of obviously do stuff with both kind of central government and kind of the devolved administrations, and certainly Wales, with all the kind of zero waste sort of aspirations and things, do seem to have kind of really gone, we're going for this, we're going for the resources angle. And I think it sets a really good focus, gets people sort of aligned. And it's also sometimes kind of just dealing with a sort of a smaller number of people, kind of that it makes the problem a bit more easier to sort of manage than kind of the UK as a whole. It's, there's a lot more variety and disparate between kind of different industries and councils and this, that and the other. Sometimes you kind of go, well, let's just try and do it at that sort of scale. And then kind of let's learn from that. And I think, the really interesting thing is, can we learn from what Wales is doing, and quickly?
Any further questions from anyone? Feel free to come off mute and throw them at us. We will stop recording in a moment.
Maybe we should stop recording to get the good questions. No, these have all been good questions, but just in case there's anything, you want some really honest questions.
I will stop the recording now, but before we do, please do come off mute and let's give Amy a quick round of applause for the lovely talk. Thank you.